Are you an aspiring starlet in need of a dress for a traveling dance troupe audition, and you don't have a mother whom you accidentally burned alive that you can steal an outfit from? Well, here's a tutorial for you. We're just gonna establish some ground rules. I will show you how to do like the Edwardian shape. This is not it. Just to show you how certain elements will turn out. I wasn't planning on making a new dress. Then, as I was sewing it, I got attached, so I just ended up finishing it anyway. I wasn't gonna keep it, but now. So it is kind of a mixture of I put too much work in it in some areas, and then some are kind of fixed post, some areas are not, and then some areas I kind of added after the dress was finished, and the other areas I really could not be bothered. Also, I'm gonna assume that you are pressing and ironing your fabrics. It just makes it so much better and more professional looking. I'm not gonna punish you if you don't, but honestly, it makes such a difference. B, adding seam allowance is important. Usually 1/2 inch is what we do. And number 5, another thing I'm assuming is that you are serging your edges, is you don't want fray. You want slay. Do you want to slay while you slay, or do you want to be basic? I also have a lot of optional details that you can skip if you don't want to do it. So you will need a tape measure, a ruler, fabric marker, or chalk, 3 to 4 yards of red fabric. Depending on how detailed you want it, maybe get 5 just to be safe. I started cotton work. The red I got was the Walmart Christmas red, and they had 2 kinds of red. Either one is fine, just make sure the lace that you are getting, you match it with it if you want to do the lace. I did the brighter, warmer red mainly because I already had red lace trim that matched that color. You will need a 20 to 24 inch red zipper, red buttons, red lace trim. You can maybe get 4 different kinds and 1 magenta. Don't get one that is wider than 1.5 inches, okay? Trust me on this. Don't get ruffled trim. Just get the seam tape style. I don't know what those are called. I think they are seam tape. You're going to need a seam ripper because you are going to make mistakes. Unless you're mid-C and everything's just perfect for you. I've broken this pattern down to basically gathering and making waves. Remember, when you gather fabric, you have to leave the seam allowance alone. One way to gather is by hand sewing using a basting stitch. Just make some loose thread running stitches on the seam allowance on the area that you want it gathered. Usually 1/8 of an inch above your seam line. Then you will pull the thread and you will see your pleats form. After pulling the thread, you can do this to basically match the length that you need, that you are attaching your gathered fabric to. You are then going to adjust the pleats in certain areas just to make sure that it's kind of evenly spread. I like this method just because it helps me with my gauge. After lining it up, you can then sew your pieces together, and remember to cut up the basting stitch. It will help you better to see it if you use a different colored thread. You can also use your sewing machine to gather. Use a gathering foot like you see here. You can adjust your stitch to be on the longest and your tension to be the highest, and it will gather it for you, and it will turn out like this. And if you do 2 stitches with the lowest tension and leave rat tails at the end, you can then get way more beautiful and even pleating. Or you can do it the lazy way, which is finding halfway points on your gathering fabric and the other piece that you're connecting it to, pinning every point and using your fingers to kind of create some pleats. Then sewing as you go until you have to make it for the next one. Next is the waves. They're not technically called waves, they're curves. Anyways, this is basically raising or lowering a certain area in your pattern and making a bump. And then you kind of make a wave. It's not just like a curve like this. You kind of do this shape, like it's a wave. I don't know what to tell you. I say wave because you gotta do wave. You will need to make 3 pattern pieces for this dress. You can do this on paper or directly on the fabric. Honestly, it's up to you. You can also practice on muslin. The bodice, the sleeve, and the skirt. Everything else is a rectangle. Or if you're extra, a trapezoid. Like, who has time for that? If you know how to draft bodice, this is the shape that you're going for. And that's for you to do. If you don't, you can use a loose shirt or a loose t-shirt as a starting point. Fold the shirt half lengthwise, then fold the sleeves inward to get the armhole shape. You will want to trace the back of the shirt, and you should have this shape afterward. I suggest doing this on paper first. Always make sure you have room to add seam allowance around it. Be careful not to use a shirt that is way too oversized or too wide on you, that when you lift your arms, it brings the end of the shirt with you like way too high. You're going to want the armhole to be like closer to your armpit. If you find where the stitches intersect and you touch that and you can still feel your armpit when you touch it, that shirt is good. But if it does this, don't use that one. You want to be able to lift your arms all the way up to swing that axe while you're dealing the finishing blow on your privileged sister-in-law who always gets what she wants. You're going to need some ease when you do the dance routine that you've been practicing for. I forgot to turn on my light. If you only have tight shirts, you might want to adjust it to be a little bit bigger. Maybe trace outside of it. You're really more trying to get a shape of a bodice. And make sure that you try on the t-shirt backwards just to kind of see if your neck is comfortable. You don't want to choke, unless you're into that. I could show you how to draft it the right way, but pattern making is annoying. I'm just kidding. Making a pattern on your bodice is totally worth it that you can adjust to certain things, so I suggest doing that. There's a bunch of tutorials online for that. This is for the people that don't want to do that much of pattern making. So after tracing your short, you're going to draw lines where you want it to end, usually where your waist is, but in this case you're going to do it on your lower waist. It's probably like a couple of inches lower than your high waist, but everybody's body is different. So this will basically be the outline of your whole bodice thing for the front and the back. For the front one, you're going to leave the line where the neck is alone, and you can just write fold on there, and then you're going to add seam allowance everywhere else. If you want to do the Edwardian shape, you're just going to mark like an inch or an inch and a half lower, and your line is in the middle, and then you're going to make this wave that's going to lead to it. It's kind of like that corset shape. If you don't have a French curve, just wing it. It's fine. Just make sure it's like flat, a half an inch from like each point, or leave it as it is. It's okay, really. I didn't add a bodice wave, and it's fine. You are going to place the fold line on the fabric fold, and you're going to cut it. Now you got this whole one piece for your front. And for your back bodice pieces, just add seam allowance. You're also going to need 2 of those. If you're working with a print, please keep in mind that there is a wrong side and a right side to the fabric, so be wary. Depending on the closure you want, make sure you adjust for it. If you're going to use a zipper, which you should, just do a standard 1/2 inch. Now you should have 3 pattern pieces that look like this. You got a front piece and 2 back pieces. If you're a beginner sewist, you're going to want to mark where you're going to stitch it. If you know how to do a puffy, long, cuffed sleeve, go do it. If not, you're going to want to take your front and your back bodice piece, and you're going to connect the shoulder line together. You're going to take the armhole shape, and you're going to trace that curve. And depending on how long you want it, maybe like a 3/4 sleeve or a long sleeve, you're going to want to measure that too. Measure your upper arm right above your elbow and add a 1/2 inch for ease. That is basically how wide the end of your sleeves are going to be. And it's time to add the wave. You're going to want to add like 5 to 6 inches in the middle of your sleeve, and then you're going to connect those with like wave or something. You know, use a French curve or estimate it. You can also maybe widen the sleeve a little bit if you want to for extra puffiness. Another optional thing is if you want to add the wave at the bottom, and it's just going to make your sleeve look like this at the bottom. So that's really up to you. I suggest doing like 1 to 2 inches only. It's basically what I showed you with the front bodice. Anyway, if you want it puffier, go higher, go wider, go crazy. Be outrageous, as you should. Even though I did make mine higher, I did not make this part wider, so that was my mistake. So I ended up only having this kind of gathering and this kind of puff, and it's not as high as I wanted it to go. While this one is like the same thing where it's like 5 inches higher, but it is like 4 inches wider, and it narrows towards the end, so it's giving you that puff look. Next, you will make a waistband. You want this to be 2 inches wide, and it's going to be the length of your waist. Of course, you're going to add seam allowance, so it's basically like 3 inches wide, actually. If you're adding a sash attached to the dress, you are going to want to make 1 front waistband piece and then 2 back waistband pieces. Add stabilizer to the waistband if you want to. You can skip the waistband too and just make a separate sash for it. Honestly, I don't know if she has a sash, if it's like separate or it's part of the dress. I couldn't tell, and when I made my first dress, I really could only see it up close in theater. There wasn't any screenshots or images online. So I was kind of drawing in the dark theater and kind of guesstimating. I did end up making a separate sash for my first dress, and in the second one I made it attached to the dress. And now I can kind of see it up close, and it doesn't have the seam on the side of the waist. So I think the sash is separate, but now that I'm looking at it more, I feel like the sash is sewn into there and the lace trim was sewn over it all the way around to cover the seam, and they just stopped it where she was gonna tie it up. So I wish I had these pictures the first time, and I didn't know it existed when I made the second one, so that's my fault. Now for this skirt, you are going to want to do a quarter circle skirt at least. I do know hers is more like 3/8 of a skirt, then gathered at the back. For the length, you're going to want to account for the ruffle or the tiered at the bottom, so you're going to deduct that from your skirt length if you're going to add it. Well, look at that, a loose thread. I feel so much better about my sewing already. I did like 12 inches on my second one, and that was too long. And if we look at this picture again, her head is kind of the same height So maybe use her head as measurement. She's like 5'7.25". We're gonna use the 8-figure model for drawing, so we're gonna divide that by 8, and so we can assume that this is like 8 inches for the bottom tier. You can use that. So you can deduct 8 inches from your total skirt length. So from your waist, measure how long you want your skirt to be. The front will be shorter than the back. That's optional. If you do want the high-low, you kind of want to measure how short you want it in the front and how long you want it in the back. So take your waist measurement. You're going to divide it by 2, then add 1 inch for seam allowance. You will then multiply that number by 8, and this will be your circumference. You will need to find the radius. I just go online, honestly. R equals circumference over 2 pi. So I did like 26 inches for waist measurement, and I got 17.825. So I'm just gonna do 17 and 7/8. You can round it off to the nearest measurement. If you use centimeters, you're not gonna have this fraction problem. So you're gonna take the corner of your fabric piece or paper, as long as both sides are straight or it has like a 90-degree angle. Fold it diagonally so you can find the middle. You can use an iron to press it. Mark it if you want to. And from this endpoint, you will measure the radius that you got. Always have to start from the corner, and you're basically gonna measuring that from there all around. Then you're gonna connect the dots. You can keep using your ruler or your tape measure to make sure it's even. I don't. I put like 8 points and then I just guesstimate. So that will be your waistline. And then from your waistline, you are going to measure your skirt length. We are first doing the front piece of the skirt. So from the waistline, measure the skirt length that you wanted for the front minus the tier or not, and you're gonna do that all the way up to the half point. This one might take a little longer. You're gonna connect those dots. You're gonna add seam allowance to the bottom and the top, and you have your front skirt piece. For the back, you're basically going to do the same thing. However, one end will be your short skirt measurement, and then the other end will be the long skirt measurement. Basically, how long you want it in the back. So you can kind of gradually increase it to where it meets there. Mine was like 3 inches difference, so it was like 3 inches shorter in the front, and it was 3 inches longer in the back, basically. The longest part of your skirt, that's where the zipper will be. You're gonna wanna mark where you wanna put your zipper there, add darts, I don't know, and you're gonna mark the side that you're gonna connect to the front. The high-low is optional. Once again, add seam allowance to the top and the bottom, and you got yourself a back piece. So you're gonna need 2 of these. So just once you cut up that piece, place it on top on another corner, or if you did it on paper, just find where there's room in your fabric, trace it, or just place it on top and then cut it up. Now you'll have 2 pieces. So my skirt is actually 3/4 of a circle. I just kind of like the drama of a fuller skirt. So you're gonna measure the bottom rounded edge, like the whole thing if you want. You're gonna get that measurement, and depending on how much gathering you want, you can multiply it by 1.5, 1 3/4, or 2. In my case, I did 2. Basically, you're gonna be cutting like a really long rectangle. So the length of how much you want your bottom tier to be, that's how wide it is, and then how long it is how much you got from multiplying your bottom skirt measurement. You have to add seam allowance, and you're gonna be folding that hem, so add an inch to how wide you want the bottom tier to be. Remember how I said I did like 3/4 of a circle? Yeah, mine was 163 inches. I had to do 27 feet of gathering. Yours will be like maybe half of that, so it's still a process. Also, if you don't want to do gathering for the bottom tier, you don't really like care for that, just add another inch plus the seam allowance, and then you're just gonna fold that over, and you're gonna mark that area where you're supposed to tier was gonna be, and then you're just gonna fold it over and you're gonna sew it. It might not be even when you sew it, because sewing on like a circle or anything round is like very tedious, and you're gonna have to like fold it in some areas to keep it straight, and it'll kind of give you this look. You're gonna have like a flounce instead of a ruffle. It's the same spirit. It's okay, I swear, no one will judge you unless you're joining a competition. After all of that, it's time to finally sew. So starting with the front bodice piece, you're gonna line up the lace trim that you want, starting from the middle. If you want to be closer to the actual dress, the lace in the middle matches the lace on the belt, and she also had trim covering the bottom tier seam. So if you want to be extra, 1 or 5, put as many lace as you want. Just try to stop when you're like a 1/2 inch from your seam line. Once again, the lace is optional. But if you want kind of the same feel and you don't have lace, you can use the same fabric and you can make your own ruffle trim. They're just long rectangles. Just double fold it on the end, gather it on the other, and there you'll have a ruffle. And there you can add it and put as many as you want on your bodice. Make sure you press it after you've sewn it on there as well. If you did the Edwardian wave at the bottom, make sure you gather the bump to match your front waist measurement before you put your lace. Next, you're gonna sew the shoulders right sides facing together, you're going to line up the back bodice pieces to the front bodice piece, and you're going to sew along that line. Next will be the sleeves. You're going to mark 2 inches from the ends of each side of the sleeve. From that mark in the middle of those, right where the bump is, that's where you're going to gather. Then you're going to pin it, and then you're going to sew. Make sure you press it. So I did mention the sash earlier. It is optional if you want to add it. You don't have to have it, but if you want to have it, just kind of helps cinch your waist more. The red dress is fitted to me, and then the white dress is bigger. So the sash at the back helps me. You will need a 5-inch wide rectangle. Mine was 40 inches long each. If you're making a separate sash, just make it 80 inches long and maybe add another 10 inches to kind of cover the waist, or however long your waist is. If you want pointed ends, make an arrow that meets in the middle. Then you're going to fold the fabric in half and then press it. Then you're going to sew one end first. You're going to clip the corners so that you get that point. And you can mark your seam allowance. That's why it's 5 inches. It's going to be 2 inches wide to kind of cover the waistband. So once you've marked it, you can sew along the side. You're going to leave the other end open. So you're going to turn this inside out. You can obviously add stabilizer for this if you want to. I didn't for mine. It's better if you cut this along the bias too. You can do the method that you like for turning stuff inside out. You're also going to want to run something like this, like a rounded tip. You're going to put a shit along the seams like so. And then you're going to want to press that, and now you got your sash piece. Another optional thing is adding pockets. It's basically like an upside down ear. So you can like place your phone on something, make an upside down ear to make sure your phone fits like the bottom. For the opening, you want to make sure your hand fits through. And remember, when you put your hand in your pocket, your hands are like kind of like this. You know, like they're kind of spread apart. So you want to account for that measurement. So you want to get from your thumb to your pinky. And that's how wide that's going to be. Make sure you add seam allowance. And once again, if you're using a print, you're going to be wary of the wrong and right side of the fabric. You're going to need 4 pocket pieces. 2 of them each are like facing a different direction. You're going to want to mark 2.5 inches from your waistline where your side seams are in your skirts. Then right sides facing each other, you're going to sew the pocket from there. Then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. For the back piece, remember where your side seam is going to be and where your zipper is going to be. You're going to sew the pocket to the side seam, basically the part that's going to connect to the front piece. Another optional thing is making a cuff for the bottom of your sleeve. You can do this method where it's like a trapezoid, and that's up to you. You figure it out. Or you can just make a rectangle that's like 1 inch wider than your arm measurement. You're going to want your cuff to be at least 2 inches wide, so just like the sash, you're going to make it 5 inches to cover the seam allowance and the fold. You can use a stabilizer to retain the shape. Or don't. Nobody cares. Depending on what you're doing to your waist area, you can sew the waistband onto the bodice pieces. The front ones to the front bodice piece, put the back ones to the back bodice pieces. You're not sewing the sides yet, so you can now attach your skirt. You can now sew the waist of the skirt to your waistband or bodice, remembering that you have to gouter the other 2 at the back. So after doing all of that, it's time to sew the sides. So to make sure that everything kind of lines up, I like to hand stitch on that area. You can pin it if you want, but I always find pinning to kind of move stuff around, especially if I don't like sewing over pins because I've broken a bunch of needles from that, and I'm scared that one will fly and go into my face. If you're doing the lace detail and the sash, put it in the front waistband first. If you're doing an open cuff for your sleeves that you're going to want to put closures on, make sure you mark 2 inches from the bottom of your sleeve, and you only start sewing the sides from there. If you're doing pockets, make sure your pockets have like a marked seam line. You will then sew like 2 stitches past this point. You're going to stop there, cut your thread, and then you are going to start 2 stitches before the bottom one. So you're going to leave that open, and then you're going to sew all the way down. Then I take my front and back pocket pieces together, and you basically sew the ear. Make sure you don't touch the seam allowance that's attached to the skirt. After that, you're going to want to press the seams that you did on the side. Also, when you're pressing, you want the seams to be apart. Now we're going to do the bottom of the sleeves. If you're going to do the open cuff, the bottom of the sleeves, remember we didn't close it all the way. You're going to take the seam allowance and fold it 1/4 inch twice, and then you're going to sew that. Whatever method of closure you want, you can do snaps or hooks or buttons will work. But before you do that, you're going to want to attach the cuff to the bottom of the sleeves first. If you did the wave, gather it before you attach it so that it fits in the cuff. So for the cuff, you're going to want to fold it, sew the ends, then you're going to want to clip the corners. You're going to turn that inside out, and then you're going to fold the seam allowance inwards, and you're going to insert the bottom of the sleeve on there. It doesn't have to be 2 inches wide. You can make it as wide as you want to. You can just double fold it and sew it. or you can even add elastic on there if it's too wide. Whatever's easier for you and whatever you're up to. Now let's do the neckline. Now that you've sewn the sides together, you can try it on and see if it's comfortable for you. Remember, you will lose like a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch onto your neck, so account for that. Go snip the edges along the neckline in the front, or cut a couple of triangles, depending. Fold it over and press it, and then I can tell you can adjust it. If it's too tight on you, maybe after doing all of that, you may want to like take out a little bit more. For the red one, I did cut out way too much from it, and I ended up putting a really wide lace trim on there, and I added like very thin elastic at the top so it kind of stays up on my neck. You can do that as well if you cut it too low, or just don't do a high neck. That's up to you. You're just gonna sew that fold, and you're just gonna add a lace trim on there. Mine was 1.5 inches. It's not even that stiff of a lace, and it stayed up. If you don't have lace, just make a cut for your neck. Once again, rectangles. Only this time, don't sew the sides. Just fold it. Add stabilizer if you want to, and then when you try it on, it's sort of making like a little loose neck shape. You're gonna want to like clip the edges like this and adjust it to where it kind of stays there, and that's up to you if you want to adjust it that way. The neck part for me was the most difficult because it was a lot of trial and error. Anything that I don't have like a sure thing that it's gonna happen for me, that's more difficult for me than 27 feet of gathering. But yeah, it's okay if you don't want to think about it. Next is the zipper. Now there are a lot of zipper tutorials out there. Best method I know is hand sewing it first. You're gonna want the lace trim to line up, the neckline, the waistline to line up. So if you have all of those lines, you're gonna want to mark that onto your zipper, and you're going to hand sew it, and basically lining up the marks to where your lines are. Pinning is too bulky. There's a tendency to stretch the fabric and the zipper. I don't want it to do this shape. Considering your skirt, even if it's like not a full circle, it will have like bias areas from how you cut it. So hand sewing tends to work out best for me to secure it. And after you hand sew it and make sure that it's lined up, zip it up and open it and see if it lines up. Then you can press it first as well when you're ready to sew onto your sewing machine. Remember, you will need to use a zipper foot. If you don't have one, just kind of be careful not to hit the plastic. And when you're sewing the zipper onto your fabric, you're gonna sew it in the same direction. Don't start from the top of one end and start on the bottom of the other. If you started at the top where the neck is, start from there on both sides. If you start from the bottom, start from there on both sides. Doing it that way will definitely make sure that you're not getting the wave in the back. And from here you can see that I sewed it like 3 times on the machine because I wasn't close enough to the end. Like, it's an invisible zipper. It's supposed to be. You don't have to go all the way to the end like I did. You can honestly just press your fabric a little bit. So if you have a marked seam line on the back, I like to put my zipper like a little bit before that, like where the seam allowance is, I don't go over, so that when I press my fabric, the little fold will kind of hide the zipper a little bit too, if you don't want to sew super close to the teeth. I always lose like maybe a couple inches on my zipper. As soon as my machine hits the pulley, I kind of stop there. I don't want to zip it back up. So I always kind of get zippers that are a little bit longer. Another optional thing is you can make this little cuff for the bottom of the zipper that you can sew onto the seam allowance so that it's secure and it's not like bunching up. So after sewing the zipper and pressing it, it's time to sew the rest of the skirt. Like I showed you with the pocket, wherein you're kind of going 2 stitches over a certain line, that's what you're going to do with where your stitches end on your zipper. Remember, take out the basting stitch that you did, if you did one. So a couple stitches over where your zipper ends. So it's going to be like 1/8 of an inch off from your seam line. You're just going to sew from there and not hitting the zipper at all. You're going to smooth it out to where you're going to meet your seam line, and then you're going to sew straight down. And then you're going to press that flap. Confession, I did not do a zipper on the white one. I did buttons. If you want to do that method, you can do that on your own. I don't want to talk about it. Buttonholes are the devil, okay? I prefer loops or any other method. I don't like buttonholes. So the longest process you're ever going to do is probably gathering the bottom tier for the skirt. You're going to want to connect all these pieces together. So you're going to get this like one big loop. It's going to be like a very long infinity scarf. Before you gather it, do the hem first. To do a hem properly, you're first going to fold, and then press, then sew, and then press again, and then fold, and then press again, and then basically repeating the process twice. But you know what? Save it for your prom dress. I mean, do it if you want it to be cleaner. I just fold like 1/2 inch and then sew it right away, and then I estimate as I go because I'm going to fold it again anyway and then sew it. Remember, I have to do 27 feet of this. You can also mark it on your presser foot and your sewing machine. Basically know where your fold is going to be. I mean, it's called a presser foot. Why do I gotta press it beforehand? I hem it first because Trying to do that at the very end and it being attached to the dress already is kind of annoying with how heavy it's gonna be. Not to mention, if you don't have enough space like I do, you might damage the lace wherever it's gonna get stuck because you're not gonna think of it. Anyway, joking aside, you do have to press it after you've done the hem though, so it just looks nicer. Now it's time for you to gather the tier. Do the methods that I showed you. Mine maybe took like 2 to 3 hours. I don't remember, just because I took breaks in between. But remember, I did a 3/4 circle skirt. You're doing half of that. After gathering, you can now sew it onto the bottom of the dress. Lining it up and pinning it takes a little long, so adjusting where you want it gathered more. And I suggest doing a bigger fold on the seams, on the side seams, to hide it better. There's this seam at the front of the skirt right in the middle, and it's barely noticeable, so unless you really look closely. If you find that while you're pinning it, you're not going to have enough of the gathered fabric to fit the skirt, you can undo stitches on certain areas and then kind of spread it a little more. Optional, once again, is putting the lace to cover the seam of the tier. It took me like maybe 45 minutes to add the lace on mine, just because you want to line it up perfectly, and then you're going to basically sew the top and the bottom, just like you do with the others. It'll take you less since your skirt is not as full as mine. After a final press, you are done. I don't know how many hours it really took me to make this dress. It's definitely shorter than the first one. I had more of an idea on how to make it. It took me maybe 5 days to really finish everything. But remember, I was doing other stuff in between. Here's basically a gauge on the yard and maybe where you want to put your pattern pieces. Obviously, get a bit more just in case. Like, I don't like to waste fabric either, but like I would rather you not be disappointed and discouraged because you didn't have enough fabric. And even if you don't have enough fabric, there are methods here for you to kind of make that dress with maybe 3 yards of fabric. And remember, add 2 to 3 hours for mistakes. Finished is better than perfect. Even if you don't finish it, what matters is you tried. I hope to see like an army of pearls when Maxine comes out, or maybe when the trailer drops and we see something great on there. You know we're gonna be busy. Remember, have fun with what you create.